Okay, so Poppies by Jane Weir, contemporary poem. This is a poem about a mother or a parent and a child who leaves home to join the military. Now, Jane Weir, this is not a personal experience. Her child hasn't done this, so this again, like a lot of the other poems, this is an imaginary, empathetic response to a contemporary conflict situation. So in the last decade, been an awful lot of British soldiers dying, and even more of them leaving home to go and fight in wars, which inevitably is going to cause anxiety amongst their relatives back home. So is this a poem about a son who leaves and dies, or is this a poem about a son who leaves and the spectre, the fear of death hangs over the parent who is left behind? It's not exactly clear from the poem whether this person dies or not. It doesn't really matter, but the effect of conflict is clear. The effect is profound and long-lasting. And this is as much about the idea of parenting and the conflict of being a parent as it is about the conflict that the son or child goes to. So a parent has a child, nurtures them, develops them, makes them into independent-minded beings, and then the child clears off and leaves the parent wondering what they can do with themselves. And in this case, it's quite an extreme example to go off to war. So this poem reads a bit like a letter. It's conversational between the parent and the son. It's reflective of what has gone on before and the process of separation. It's a little bit rambling, it lacks form. If you look at the poem, you can't say, oh yeah, this is a sonnet, this is in tercets or quatrains. It's not. It's rambling. There are relatively few line endings that are punctuated, so we have the idea of an enjambment of run-on sentences. We have lots of punctuation within the lines, caesura, which suggests interruption. It suggests that this is not necessarily clear thoughts. It rambles. And I think that's because it's personal. It's an emotional reaction to something, and Jane Weir is, in this poem, mimicking the thought process of a parent in this situation. And it's clear that it's personal, as we have dotted around all of these pronouns, I. And you know, this is important because it's intrapersonal. It requires us to empathise and to understand. It isn't looking at the world en masse. It's looking at something very personal and individual. The meaning of the poem, if you like, is centred on the parent. It's a battle between the nurturing aspect of parenting and the right thing, which is to let go of a child at some point and let them do what they want. And if that is to put themselves into danger, then that's it. It goes against all your instincts as a parent because you want to protect. And we can understand that. That's perfectly logical. So the development of that is quite interesting because Jane Weir is a fabric designer, and she talks about this separation and this nurture from the point of view of a fabric designer, and the metaphor she uses, the extended metaphor, is that of cloth, of using materials to build up that relationship and also to demonstrate the separation in the relationship. So it's about fabric, it's about layers of images put on top of each other to reinforce the relationship and, more importantly, the separation between parent and child. So structurally, it is in several parts. We have the section here, which is the child leaving, and further down we have the moment of the child having left, and then back up here we have the idea of the freedom of the child. And let's just look at that for a second. It says, on reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial. So there's obviously some very emotive vocabulary here. The war memorial refers to a place where people go to remember those who died, who never came back. At the top of the hill, what could that be a reference to? Could it be biblical? Could it be the hill on which Jesus was crucified? Possibly, possibly not. But it's reminiscent of sacrifice, which is what that event was about. Leaned against it like a wishbone. Obviously, to wish is to want something that you can't have. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. So very importantly, we have this idea here of your playground voice, which is harking back to that period in this child's life when they were completely dependent upon the parent, and the parent hopes to hear. He's never going to hear it again from that kid's mouth, but they hope to hear. They want that moment back. But in terms of freedom, we have the dove pulled freely against the sky. Now again, dove, it's emotive, it connotes peace, but it also connotes freedom, the idea of a bird flying away, and pulling freely, not being held back by anything, not having a parent guilt trip them into anything. But the consequences of that could be that the child is now dead, possibly, or at least is in danger. But the fact that they've been allowed to do it, I think Jane Weir is saying is the correct thing to do. It's difficult, but it is about growing up. And the conflict in this poem isn't really the conflict happening somewhere else. It's the conflict in parenting, in the act of nurturing and then freeing your children to do what they want. Quickly looking at this metaphor here, the ornamental stitch. So the dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. It's an interesting one. If you think about an ornament, a fairly useless thing that collects dust on your mantelpiece. A stitch is something that connects two things, brings two things together, and bonds them. So we can see quite clearly how that can be used from a parental point of view, that she wants to reconnect two things, the past with the present. But perhaps it's never going to happen. And the ornamental aspect of that is that what she's left with is something on a mantelpiece, if you like, something that is a memory, something that connects only at a surface layer and will never really be personalised again. And if we go back to the start, it talks about Armistice Sunday, which we should be aware is the act of remembrance that still takes place. And poppies are integral to this, and the imagery of a poppy is very emotive and potent and something that we're all aware of. It needs really no explanation. And when you couple this with the idea of a parent and a child being separated by conflict, it's even more emotive. But when it becomes personal here, it says, before you left, and that pronoun's as important as all of the I. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disturbing a blockade of yellow bias, binding around your blazer. All of these nouns and adjectives are really references to cloth, to fabric. So from the off, to give us a sense of the connection between these two people, you have this idea of fabric and the tactile nature of fabric and the way that fabric is so important to our lives. It sits close to our skin. It is part of us. It's our identity. We use cloth in that way to say who we are, and we do that with our children as well. Parents, more often than not, create children in their own image, and they quite like people to know that, whether that's a good thing or not. Sellotape bandage around my hand. Obviously, that's a very emotive word there. Bandaged. It connotes the sense of pain, of danger, of suffering. I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. So, to allow this child to be free up here, this parent did not want the child to see the pain the child was causing. Yeah, it's not the child's fault they're causing it, but it is there. It is a fact. So she steals the softening of my face, and that's a very strong verb. To steal in this sense, to harden. It contradicts the softness of the cloth, of the fabric. The fabric is very personal, but to hide emotion, you have to put up a barrier. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos like we did when you were little. And again, this links back to the playground voice, the idea of a time that was precious, that has gone, that you never get back. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gel black thorns of your hair. There's a harshness to this again, like steeled. There's a sense that the child doesn't want that interpersonal connection, doesn't want that emotional pull. It doesn't. And the black thorns of that suggest a prickliness, the idea that the child needs to be let go. It would be wrong for them to stay. But the parent wants to treat them like a kid still. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt. So again, that idea, we've got that contrast between the soft here and here, and the hard, the necessarily hard way in which you have to let your children go. Slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open as if to say, there you go, the world's your oyster, get on with it. The world overflowing like a treasure chest, which is a fantastic metaphor, simile, because it harks again back to the idea of being a child, of playing with your treasure chest, of a fantasy of having no worries about anything. And in this sense, the metaphor is that the world is your treasure chest. Go out and find it. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. Intoxicated, we normally associate with alcohol, but in this sense, we associate it with the idea that there is something amazing to be found, and you're going to go for it, and you're not thinking of the consequences. You are young, you are invincible. The parent knows otherwise, and that's where the conflict comes from. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Now, is that a metaphor? Did the kid really have a songbird in a cage? Or is this tears? Is this the emotional release that she needed? Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me. So the bedroom is a very important place for a kid. But from the bedroom, it leads her to the churchyard walls. So a sacred place. A place where people turn in times of trouble, even if they don't believe in God. It's something that is universally in this country seen as a place where death and misery are laid to rest, literally sometimes. My stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, gloves, winter coat. Again, lots of fabric, lots of... The only way this woman now can protect herself is to wrap herself up in fabric, in cloth, in the fabric of life. This isn't necessarily simply clothing. This is the world which she has created over time, that has been blown apart by this child deciding to join the army. So in terms of connections with the poems, the effects of conflict, you can, pretty much all of them. The Charge of the Light Brigade, the sense of loss, in futility, falling leaves, come on, come back. But this is slightly different to a lot of the poems, in that it's not a conflict that you can necessarily put your finger on. It's a bit like Belfast Confetti in that sense, that it's very personal. But the conflict is the conflict of allowing somebody to be free, and that freedom comes at a cost.